So we're letting just everybody come in. So hello, everybody, whoever's coming in the room. It'd been lovely to see some faces, but we understand if you do want to kind of stay behind the screen or behind your name. So if you're happy to kind of come onto screen, it'd be lovely to see you. So we'll just let everybody come in. We are expecting about 30, so we'll just give it about 30 seconds before we kickstart. But luckily you get me first, so at least those latecomers won't have to listen to me rabble on for a few minutes before we go to the main show. So we'll let everybody in. I don't think there's anybody else in the waiting room, so we'll just kickstart because we're dead on 2 o'clock. So thank you, everybody, for coming this afternoon to our second talk of the Rescue, Reuse, Regenerate, Reviving Town Centres online talk series. So we had our first talk last week, which was Hannah at Nudge Community Builders down in Plymouth. So an absolutely fascinating talk from her last week on risk and being brave and being creative. So I think some of the local authorities that were on the screen with us and who joined us were a little bit scared by some of the risk taking, but it's nice to see that some people are out there pushing those boundaries in the world of regeneration. So just to let you know, we are the Heritage Trust Network. We are a membership organisation across the UK. So if you're not a member, get in touch with us because it'd be great to talk to you, because we have, as I say, we have over 800 members now, which range from building preservations trusts to community groups, to heritage professionals, and all sorts of things that kind of cover the world of heritage across the UK. And it's very much a support mechanism out there. We've got toolkits, we've got talent banks, all sorts of things to support your journey in whatever element of heritage you guys work in. So if you'd like to talk to us more a bit about the Heritage Trust Network, we do have some introduction to Heritage Trust Network online events, just for a quick kind of overview of what the network does. So Bev, I'm sure, will pop that link in the chat if she can find it. Sorry, that's a bit on the spur on the moment. So if you want to find out a bit more about the Heritage Trust Network, pop onto one of those events. It's only half an hour and it's a nice quick overview of what we do. Now, I'm probably teaching you all to suck eggs, but obviously just a little bit of online etiquette throughout this talk, if we can. If you don't mind, if you could keep muted throughout the talk this afternoon, it would be greatly appreciated. Obviously, any distractions around you limit. And if you've got any questions or comments at all, please pop those into the chat box and we will relay those back to the speakers at the end of their talk. Unless they ask you to unmute yourselves or to kind of get involved in discussion, if you could please remain muted, that would be great. And as I say, we'll relay any questions back to them at the end. And then we're also more than happy to get people unmuted at the end as well to have a bit of a discussion. And we're, of course, happy if you want to turn your camera off and hide behind your name. It's not a problem at all. We do have Bev on board as well. So if you have any technical issues at all throughout this event, she is there to let you back in if you drop out. So just come straight back in and we'll get you back into the room. Or if there's any technical issues that you have, please contact us. Bev will pop her, if that's okay, Bev, can you pop your email address in there into the chat box, just in case you have any issues at all, just during the event. So just get in touch with Bev, or as I say, pop that into the chat box. Now, some of you have got some very weird names on here. So if you could please pop your proper name and introduce yourselves into the chat box, that would be lovely as well, so that you can kind of see who else is available. We are a network, so, if there's somebody you want to reach out to, say hello to them. I'm sure they will welcome the connection. You're all after the same thing, a bit of regeneration, understanding and everything like that. So by all means, do that. We have been already touring around the UK to discuss this rethink, reuse, regenerate. And we've been to Wales, we've been to Manchester, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Reading. So myself and the CEO of the Heritage Trust Network, David, have scoured the country and we have gone through and we've welcomed nearly 200 delegates to these events with a variety of absolutely brilliant speakers, fascinating discussion and some great tours of heritage action zones, regeneration centres, and also some beautiful buildings as well that have either gone through regeneration or going through regeneration. So it's been an absolute whistle-stop tour, which has been absolutely brilliant. And as I say, we've welcomed 200 odd delegates to those events. Now, if you haven't booked a series ticket for the rest of this series, then please do. We've got those other 4 talks after today coming up. So it'd be great to kind of see you on any of those other tours, but we'll send those links out to you afterwards as well. But today's event is all about the authors of High Street. And we were very lucky that we had Dr. Lucy Montague with us in Ireland. So she came across the waters with us to speak in Lurgan. But we're very lucky today that we have all 3 of the authors of High Street, which is really nice for us to have. So it's absolutely brilliant that we're able to kind of have all 3 of you on board. Has that not stopped sharing the full screen? Hang on 2 seconds. Sorry. So we're very lucky to have all 3 of them on board with us today. So Vicky, Lucy and David, thank you very much for this. This is a bit of a 3-year project, wasn't it, with hundreds of case studies across the UK, looking at all the different town centres and the high street. So the knowledge that these guys have gained over the last few years is absolutely brilliant. And as you can see from their brief bios on the screen, they certainly know what they're talking about. They've got definitely expertise in all sorts of urban regeneration, architecture, and designing as well. So thank you very much, all 3 of you, for joining us today. And I'm very much looking forward to this fascinating talk with all 3 of you. So thank you again for booking onto us. And as we always have to do, this project is funded. So thank you very much. If you play the National Lottery, you have helped fund today's event. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass over to Lucy, who's going to share hers, and we're going to kickstart the presentation. So thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the next hour or so.
Thank you, Hannah. I think I'm going to kick off. We're going to do this in 3 parts, and it's great because actually we've not had a chance to present this material with 3 of us before. We've done it in 1s and 2s, but never before as 3. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to kick us off. I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of the history of the high street, I guess, is what I'm going to talk about. Lucy's going to take over and talk about some of the research and findings, and then Vicky's going to talk about the conclusions and recommendations that came out of it. So as you said, two-year piece of work. It wasn't hundreds of case studies, it was 100, and that was actually more than enough. We realized we'd probably bitten off more than we could chew with 100, but 100 case studies plus data on all those places to really try and understand what is happening on the high street, and in particular with the current crisis. So we start the book in Sheffield, and this is the hole in the road. For those of you who may remember Sheffield from the past, the hole of the road, it no longer exists. It's Castle Square, it's called. And it had 6 department stores around Castle Square. You can see the C&A in the background there. There was a House of Fraser, there was a Co-op department store and so on. And they've all gone. There are no department stores around Castle Square anymore. If you go to the next slide, Lucy. So this is one of those department stores. This is the old Co-op. It's a beautiful building, designed by the Co-op's in-house architects in the late 50s with you can see the sculpture on the stairs and so on. And this is the Co-op's gone completely, and what the Co-op is now is the following slide, if we go to the next one, which is called Commune with a K, of course, which is a food hall on the ground floor with workspace on the upper floors and various cultural things happening. And so in a sense this sums up what's happened on the high street. And then whilst places like Commune say they're unique, of course they're not, because pretty much every city and even quite small towns have this type of food operation, street food thing going on. But it shows how the high street is changing. And it became clear to us as we were walking through Sheffield that Sheffield has actually changed completely. So if you go to the next slide, Lucy, please. This is Fargate. So this is just a little bit down from Castle Square. This does at least have some shops still. You can see a Marks and Spencer's on the left-hand side, but at least half the shops in Fargate are either phone shops or banks, and so it's actually very much declining as a shopping place to be. Because the next slide, please. A little bit further on from Fargate, you come to the wonderful John Lewis building, built in the 60s, and of course John Lewis during lockdown, in fact, threatened to pull out of Sheffield. Sheffield Council put all the stops out to try and keep them, including buying the building. for £4 million and leasing it back to John Lewis on a turnover rent to try and keep them in the city. And they reversed that decision for as much as, I think, 9 months it lasted before John Lewis finally decided to close down and leave Sheffield altogether. This is traditionally in Sheffield, this is called Cole Brothers. And so the John Lewis was always the Cole Brothers, and people in Sheffield still called it Cole Brothers because it's the old department store, which comes from the 1840s, that's originally set up in Sheffield. And this is now gone. And actually, Sheffield have recently done a deal with Urban Splash to take on this building and to turn it into workspace with some retailing on the ground floor, again indicative of what's happening on retail. The next one, please. And one of the reasons that Sheffield has struggled so much in retail terms, and this is weird because we were always very concerned about big shopping centres, but Sheffield never built a big shopping centre. When all the other cities, you're building the New Street, the Bullring Shopping Centre in Birmingham or the Arndale Centre in Manchester, Sheffield never built one, and so it was always very traditional shopping centre. This is the plans that they had to build the retail quarter, or Sevenstones, it was called at one point, which have just never found their way to realisation. This was a scheme which was going on, has been planned in the planning for 15 years, and probably will. I mean, parts of it are being built, but it will never be built as a new retail centre. We go to the next slide. What we do have left on in Sheffield is the Moor, and this is a picture of the Moor. Debenhams, of course, on the right is now gone, but the Moor is basically all that's left of Sheffield's shopping offer. The Moor used to be a secondary retail area in Sheffield compared to Fargate and Castle Square. It's now all that's left. And it's actually, and I mean, one of the things is you don't appreciate this is happening because it happens so slowly, but actually you look back and think this is a major city and actually its retailing has collapsed. And the reason for it, I think, is obvious from the next slide, which is Meadowhall. So Meadowhall was built on a former steelworks in Sheffield within the city council. It was actually given planning permission, even one could say promoted by the city because of its 6,000 jobs, which at the time was seen as very important. But Sheffield, the Meadowhall opened. It's about half the size of the city centre at the time, and all the shops opened, 2 branches. And since then, they've closed the Sheffield branch and kept the Meadowhall branch. And so Sheffield has essentially been killed off by a big out-of-town shopping centre in the way that the Metro Centre never killed Newcastle and the Trafford Centre never killed Manchester. But because Sheffield was weak, essentially in a weak state as a shopping centre, it's had a profound effect. And so in the introduction, we talk about the city without shops, Sheffield being a place where the retailing has essentially collapsed. Now, the important thing to say, next slide, is that this doesn't mean Sheffield is a basket case as a city. Sheffield's a fantastic city. This is Kelham Island, and if you go to the next slide, you've got Devonshire Square. It's a really lively place. It's got a growing population. It's got a huge amount of cultural activities. It's a great place to go out for a night out. Just because it's lost its retailing doesn't mean it's in decline as a city. In fact, quite the contrary. And this is sort of sums up our entire argument in that the big retail that we've relied upon for years and years is in steep decline. But that doesn't mean that town centres are dead. There is a life after the retail crisis, and Sheffield is a really good example about how you can thrive without shops. So that's by way of introduction. If we go on to the next slide, please. In the first part of the book, we talk about the fact that the high street's been in perpetual crisis in many ways from the 1950s, and the first phase of that, the first crisis, if you wish, is the one that was initiated by the supermarkets. So next slide, please. I put this slide in to the Clarico unit. This is from Google Earth, but the Clarico unit you can see there, which is currently an estate agent. So when I was a small boy, and in the 60s, where the Clarico unit was a shop called Williams Corner, and I used to go with my mum to this shop. And when we first went, Mr. Williams would serve us or his assistants over the counter. And then one day we came in and Mr. Williams had got rid of the counter and he'd put baskets by the door and all the shelves were full of the produce that my mum had to go and pick off herself from the from the shelves, and then she went to the end, and then she went to the checkout and paid for it. And for her, this was a revelation. This idea that you would shop in that way, and this happened in the 50s in the UK. If you go to the next slide, please. It happened in the 30s in America, and so the shops that look like the shops on the left-hand side, which lined every high street, and Sainsbury's started off like this in the 1870s, transferred over to something looking very like the picture on the right. And this sort of self-service revolution happened initially on the high street. And so what happened was shops were converted on the high street, and then very quickly they realized that there was not enough space for this new type of retailing on the high street. And so next slide, if you would. You have this move to out of town. So Piggly Wiggly was a strange name, but was the first supermarket in the US, the first retailer to do this. Mac Markets, or Mac Fisheries, you might remember, was one of the early ones in the UK. All the supermarkets in the UK compete for the title of the first supermarket. They've each got a claim to have built that, but basically late 40s, early 50s, the supermarket started to create units in the UK. And we tell the story about each of the retailers. The main ones, Tesco's, which started off as a tea brand in London market. Sainsbury's, which is the oldest one, which goes back to, again, a London store back in the 1870s. And Morrison's, which was only created in the 1950s in Bradford market. So Morrison's is the most recent of them. So next slide, please. And this affects everything. So, I mean, one of the things that you get with this is that this is where the brands come from, because previously you went in and asked for some rice or some flour, and the retailer gave you their rice and flour. When you're picking it off the shelf, you need to have your eye caught by brands, and so all of a sudden the brands became really important because of these supermarkets. And you can see at the bottom of the screen there the impact of this. And so in 1960 there were only 572 supermarkets, and by 2012 there were 8,000, and they had 97% of retail spend. Now I'll say that again: 97% of grocery spend went through the supermarkets. This is just a devastation of a whole retail sector which once dominated the high streets. If you go to the next one, please. So this is a butcher, baker, and a candlestick maker. I can't speak for candlestick makers, but if you go for traditional food shops, the numbers have dropped from 120,000 in 1950 to 30,000 in 2018. But interestingly, from our data, they've started rising very slightly since 2018. There has been a slight revival, and that's one of the conclusions that we'll come to later on. Next one, please. So then we got the next crisis. This happened in the 1990s, and you'll remember a government minister called Nicholas Ridley, who decided that the government and the planning system had no right telling anyone where they should shop, and open the door to out-of-town retailing. So basically, under Nicholas Ridley and Thatcher's government, all of a sudden retailers could get permission to build out-of-town stores, and there was a huge boom in out-of-town retailing. Next one, please. Here's Nicholas Ridley on the left-hand side of this picture. The guy in the middle is Ernest Hall, who is the guy that opened the Metro Centre in Newcastle, and the guy on the right is the leader of Gateshead Council. So altogether cutting the ribbon on the Metro Centre when it opened in 1985 as the first big out-of-town covered shopping centre in the UK. And at the time, there were plans for 50 of these things. The next slide shows Meadowhall when it was under construction. Something we'd never seen before in the UK. The size of a city centre, all under one roof, huge amounts of parking. The government paid for the road junction, just to show how this was not something which was done in the face of public policy. This was also in an enterprise zone, so it didn't need planning permission, believe it or not. And so there were plans for 50 of these across the country. Only 10 or 11, depending on how you categorize them, were built. And actually, we really dodged a bullet, because if you go to the US, where they built literally 1,000 of these things, the town centres were killed off completely. We did stop building them at some point. What we didn't stop so much was these retail parks, or strip malls, as the Americans call them. And pretty much every town's got one of these retail parks. And again, they started off as just bulky goods, furniture and carpets, and very soon they were including Boots and Next and other mainstream retailers, and they have sucked the life and quite a lot of the spending power out of towns. So the government in the mid-90s decided to do something about this. Next slide, if you would. And commissioned this report, which I was peripherally involved in. It was an URBED report. So when we started this research, we were all working for URBED. And the URBED Plus is a collaboration with the university. But URBED did this in '95. My colleague Nicholas Falk was very much involved in this. And this was a change in government policy. So after this piece of work, the government introduced PPG 6, as it was called, Planning Policy Guidance Note 6, which basically said that retailing would be allowed in town centres first and would only be allowed out of town if there wasn't a suitable town centre site. And it really worked. So within 5 or 6 years, 80% of all new retailing was taking place in town rather than out of town. And if you ever doubt the power of planning to change the world, this is as good an example as you'll find of a public policy, planning policy, completely changing the market in terms of town centres. There was still a lot of out-of-town stuff which had been built, so it didn't fix it completely, but they did lead in the 2000s to quite a boom in town centres and quite a boom in town centre investment. So the next slide, if you would, is I think one of the diagrams from that, which I think, we've moved on in terms of our graphic abilities since that time. But yeah, this was the sort of action plan to bring about town centres, to make them more attractive, to look at ways and the things that they had which brought people in, their accessibility and their amenity. Next slide, please. So this brings us to the 2000s, and as I say, a time of quite heavy investment in town centres. In some respects, one might see it as a success, but what happened about were this idea that all town centres were becoming the same. All town centres are being dominated by quite a small group of 50 or 60 mainstream retailers, and pretty much every high street looked the same, had the same retailers with the same fascias, and became indistinguishable. So the Clone Town label became something which people were very concerned about. Next slide, please. What was actually more important, in many respects, not that that's not important, but actually what was happening was the seeds of the current problems were being laid. So Debenhams, for example, a fine old retailer which goes back into the 19th century, was bought in 2003, I think it was, by a venture capitalist. They bought it without debt. They took out £1 billion or more in dividends over the course of a few years, 3 years, and then they sold it with huge amounts of debt, having sold off all the stores. So basically, they bought it, sold all the stores, leased those stores back with upwards only rent reviews, and all of a sudden Debenhams, a company which owned all its own real estate, found itself leasing all its stores and in a completely vulnerable condition if there was ever a downturn in the market, which of course was inevitable. The same thing happened to Arcadia, which is obviously started off as Burton's, and again another old retailer which was forced by its investors to sell off all its stock, all its stores, and therefore ended up in the same problem. So this is what happened. So at this stage, next one, please. We had this huge investment. This is Liverpool One, which happens to be a BDP project. Probably the last great gasp of shopping centre developments in 2008, just before the recession. But huge amounts of money going into these things. The next one, if you would, is the Bullring in Birmingham, and drawn with no intention to make it look menacing at all there, but nevertheless these things sort of almost landing like spaceships on town centres in town, which was good. They weren't being built as peripheral malls as in the US, but nevertheless huge corporate investments in city centres. So next slide, please. Brings us to the financial crash, 2008, where all this came crashing down. Essentially, retail investment went off a cliff. There was all the schemes which hadn't been committed were cancelled at that time. Next slide, please. Starting with Woolworths, as you may recall. I don't know why that says January 2019. It should say 2009. But that's when Woolworths went down, and this was the great shock because Woolworths was on every high street. and it really was the sort of the sign that something was seriously wrong with the high streets. Woolworths had in fact sold off most of its property as well and had the same problem, but it was the first victim to go. So next slide, please. And what happened with many places, and this is Stafford, is that they built their new shopping centre with that great wave of investment. They'd anchored it with a Debenhams. They'd attracted all their mainstream retailers into the new shopping centre, and then the Debenhams closed down or moved out. And what they found was that they killed off their old town centre, which Stafford has done. Basically, when all the retailers moved out, the main part of Stafford, the main old part of town, started to really struggle into a new shopping centre. And then when the new shopping centre lost its anchor store, that started to struggle as well. And this is the story which is true of probably about 5 or 6 of our case studies, that the retail investment is the thing that triggered the decline and the problem. So this is the way that the process has worked. And the idea, and there's all these retail agents going around still, to be honest, telling towns that their problem is they don't have sufficient mainstream retailers and therefore they need to build a new shopping centre to attract them. And really, that this has been the cause of the problem rather than the solution. Next slide, please. So Mary Portas, you may recall, David Cameron appointed Mary Portas. And the figures there just show in the 2 years before Mary Portas, 10,000 shops closed. And the vacancy rate had risen to 16%, which was apocalyptic at the time, but is actually less bad than the crisis which we just had since 2018. If you go to the next one, please, which brings us to the current crisis. If we can still call it current, started 2018, so it started before COVID. And what happened, the figures are actually really startling in terms of the number of retail jobs and the number of closures since that time. So these are you can see the job losses. And this is about 5 times greater than the 2008 crisis. The figures for 2020 looked like they were coming down, but 2022, sorry, looked like they were coming down, but actually then went up again after the research was done. So you saw Into collapse, the biggest shopping centre owner in the country. Your House of Fraser collapsed, being bought by Mike Fraser, Mike Ashley, sorry. Arcadia disappeared, and M&G Investments may be less well known, but they were the people that owned and funded a lot of the shopping centres, collapsed as well. So you had this absolute collapse. And if you go to the next one, please. The question is why? Because there wasn't a recession in 2018. It wasn't like the 2008 crash. There wasn't an obvious reason. There were lots of these things going on. Basically, there's business rates. There's a revaluation in 2017, which didn't help. There was the rise of online shopping, but that was going up very gradually. Well, there wasn't anything particularly in 2018 which triggered this. And what essentially we come to the conclusion was that it was a loss of confidence. But the market basically realized that retailing wasn't the dead cert that they always thought it was. And that loss of confidence then mushroomed and retailers started closed and so on. Then then COVID arrived, and all of a sudden you got this really quite serious crash. So that is my sort of bit, which is sort of brings you up to almost the present day. And this is the point at which we started thinking about, are town centres really in a bad a state as we think they are, and what can we do about it? So I'm going to hand over to Lucy at that point.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so to give you a little explanation of the research that we actually did, the project was called Tales of the High Street. It was funded by the Royal Commission for the Exhibition of 1851 and their Built Environment Fellowship. And we basically spent 3 years looking to understand what has happened in the past, as David has now described to you, and how places responded to those previous crises, and therefore perhaps what we should be doing next to understand the current crisis and how we might move through that. As the name suggests, Tales of the High Street was really motivated by the 3 of us suspecting that a lot of research into high streets looks a lot at data, but not necessarily at the stories and the capturing the sheer variety of the types of places and also the discrepancies between why a strategy might work very well in one place but not in another. So that's why we, for some reason, committed to 100 case studies and trying to understand not just what the empirical data was showing us, but talking to a lot of people to understand the stories and the kind of key figures, the key agents in the success or the failure of different towns and cities across the country. As Hannah already described, we kind of come from a series of slightly different backgrounds, the three of us, bringing to the project both industry knowledge, public sector knowledge, and academic sort of research skills. So we were aiming to provide very robust findings that show us a lot of different views on why this could be the way it is. But we also bolstered that with an advisory group that included people from the likes of CBRE, local authorities, Manchester Urban Institute, the Combined Authority in Manchester, as well as like retailers and people that are involved from that perspective as well. So we met with them a few times to sort of test out what we thought the answers were and see how they landed. The 100 case studies that we foolishly committed to were distributed across the country geographically, but also aimed to really capture the different types of towns and cities that we have. So in terms of scale, yes, but also the different kind of characteristics and pressures and opportunities of these places that have perhaps been really successful, also places that are really struggling and what can be learned from all of those. In total, that was 54,749 shops, which is 160 square feet of retail floor space, which is about 21% of all retail outlets in the UK. So it was a pretty sizable sample, giving us some quite reliable results. What I'm going to take you through now is essentially what some of that seemed to be showing us, both in terms of the data, but then the trends that have been suggested. So first of all, if we look at vacancy data, organized by the type of centre. So we've got categories that are small cities and larger towns, out of town retail, towns, cities, small towns, villages, and high streets. You'll notice some of those are, of course, not what you would necessarily call high streets, out of town, but we took the view that you really can't understand what's happening on the high street as a typology unless you also understand what's happening in these other places, including online retail. What this data seemed to suggest is a very drastic change to our high streets. And of course, the impact of that will depend on how the reduction in floor space is distributed. Savills have said we've got probably 40% too much retail floor space in the UK. That might be a little overestimated based on perhaps an assumption that to relet it, you would have to relet it to other retail rather than different uses. But it's certainly a really substantial amount of retail floor space that we don't need, and it won't be evenly distributed, I think, so much worse for some places than others. Before the pandemic, the assumption was that the remaining retailing would concentrate itself in big city centres, so meaning that, you know, retailers that would once have needed like 400 to 500 shops to cover the whole of Great Britain, with the impact of greater mobility and online sales, they can actually now achieve that with only 80 to 100 stores. So it's very bad news, basically, for any town centre that's outside the top 100 or so. But the pandemic has somewhat reversed that. The big cities have, of course, all felt the effects of the new trend towards work from home, hybrid working, and reduction in tourism. The pattern of hybrid working is unlikely to completely reverse itself. So deprived of those office workers, they're really doing particularly badly compared to suburban centres who have tapped into that home working market, in fact. So what that tells us really is nowhere is immune to these changes, and the next few years are quite critical. If a town or city centre gets things wrong, as Sheffield did perhaps with Meadowhall in particular, it could find itself facing a future which is without, or at least with far less, retailing. So it'll need to reinvent itself, as David described in Sheffield, or face collapse. If we move on to look at the data on independent retailers, as opposed to those major multiple retailers that have chains across the country, we generated what we called the Indie Index. Very catchy, I'm sure you'll agree. The data we had from our case studies allowed us to differentiate between those big multiples and the independents. Experian defines multiples as those that are part of a network of at least 9 or more outlets. So this Indie Index tells us the ratio of independent stores to multiples within any given place. 81 of our case studies had this data available, and the average was 2.7 on the Indie Index. So in other words, for every, there were 27 independent retailers in a place for every 10 multiples. The highest representation of independents, though, is on the high street and in small towns where they occupy just over 71% of units. The next is large cities where 66% of the units are independent and slightly lower percentages in the small cities and larger towns. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the lowest of all are the malls, the shopping centres, where just 25% of the units are independent. And that really goes to explain why they've been so vulnerable to the crisis, the latest crisis, which is a crisis very much in mainstream big retailing. So town centres are already overwhelmingly independent, and the independent share in the high street is increasing. In 2012, the index was 1.7, so there were 10 fewer independents for every 10 multiples that there are today. And whilst the majority of retail floor space is occupied by multiple retailers, because of course they occupy much larger footprints, larger units, this data is important to correct the way that we've been doing retail assessments so far, that really put so much emphasis on measuring the success of a town centre based entirely on the presence of a few multiple retailers. There are only 7 places in our case studies with more multiples than independents. That includes Milton Keynes and Winsford, new towns, of course, whose town centre essentially is a shopping mall. And right at the other end of the graph, the most independent places in our case studies are Belgrave Road in Leicester, where you've got 88 independents for every 10 multiples. 5 of the top 10 places are high streets, and the others are smaller towns. Surprisingly, perhaps, Camden only came 14th in the list, with 40 multiples for every 10 independents, but that doesn't include Camden Market, so it might be slightly misleading. Surprisingly, though, independents outnumber multiples 5-1 in London's West End, while quirky Brighton only comes 21st on the list, just above Nottingham, which is the most independent of all the provincial cities. So this brings me to the first trend that we want to highlight for you today, which is the march of the independents. If we look at some of the other case studies that we examined, Hebden Bridge is perhaps a nice example of where originally its cheap housing attracted what became known as the Hebden Bridge hippies. In the 60s, they convened a public meeting to agree a 4-point strategy for the town, cleaned it up, put on events for visitors, convert those visitors to residents, and use their money to rescue the town's industrial buildings. Of course, that one's quite famous and far down its path in that trajectory, but there are other nearby ones as well that have replicated similar sort of patterns, such as Todmorden with Incredible Edible, and the lesser known Slowett, which looks like Slaithwaite when it's spelled, who have been driven by the sort of grassroots community-led instigation of things like a community-owned grocer, a community-owned bakery, taking advantage of admittedly strategic locations where they're within kind of commuting distance to major cities. And you might ask, which of those things comes first? Is it, it's a chicken and egg scenario. Are all those small businesses and community-led startups the product of having the right captive audience there to spend their money? Or are those people drawn to the place because of these businesses? And it's probably in reality a little bit of both. But in many places, independent businesses are actually rapidly filling the gaps left by multiples. Independent and creative businesses, artisan food outlets, vinyl record shops, vintage clothing emporiums, independent bookshops, all of these are growing. It's not only true of independent shopping districts like Camden Lock or Brighton's North Lane or Manchester's Northern Quarter. It can also be found in smaller towns and villages like Frome, Todmorden and Slowett, as I mentioned, and suburban centres too, like Chorlton, Gosforth, Ecclesall Road, where there are lots of commuters to support those local businesses, especially with people working from home an increasing amount. So independent businesses are also dominating areas with large ethnic minority populations, like Belgrave Road in Leicester or Ladywood Road in Birmingham. The resurgence, I'd like to note, of independence on our high streets is not purely a tale of co-ops and grassroots community action and artisan bakers, etc., all that alternative culture. In our case studies, the proportion of units occupied by independent retailers was 56% in 2012 and has risen to 61% pre-pandemic, is now at 63%. The majority of the high streets are independent. They're a vital part of our town centres, but most of that growth has been vape shops, nail bars, hairdressers, barbers, tattoo parlours, and of course the ever-present fast food takeaways and chicken shops. The biggest, though, of all the independent retailers is convenience stores. So there's 50,000 of those in the UK, roughly, and 70%, over 70% are independent. Before we get too carried away and come to the conclusion that independents are the answer to the current crisis, we should bear in mind that at the height of the retail crisis in 2019, there were more job losses and business closures amongst independent businesses than amongst the multiples. It's a very fragile sector. Independents have very limited financial reserves. They carry high levels of debt. So it's not that they're more resilient, it's that for every independent business that folds, there's another one usually willing to give it a go, given the right conditions. The vitality of the sector makes it a really big opportunity, though, for local authorities who are looking to regenerate their town centres, and a relatively modest package of measures to support them can have actually quite a big impact. So in our case studies, we've come across things like schemes to make small fit-out grants available, rates relief, encouraging independents to take on vacant units with pop-ups, low commitment options, basically. We've seen local councils act as intermediaries, taking on vacant units themselves and then subletting them to independents. We've seen market stalls, pop-ups, as I mentioned, and even independent department store in Bournemouth, Bobby's, creating accessible low commitment space that independents can take on. We've also heard about daisy chaining, clustering, after dark festivals linked to late night opening in Colchester, and all the usual business support, advice, promotion, this kind of thing, which has really helped in the places that have done well with high percentage of independents. If we look now at the data we gathered on the breakdown of different types of commercial activity on the high street in our case studies, you can see that certain ones are countering the decline of others. Services are really coming to dominate our town centres, rising from just under 56% of units in 2012 to 63% in 2021. The graph in particular shows that food and beverage sector makes up by far the largest proportion of those these service users. So just under 9,400 units in 2012, risen to over 11,000 in 2021. The same trend can be seen in so many towns and city centres, and that's really reflected in our data. That includes over 3,000 pubs, bars, bar restaurants that are all up about 25%. Cafes and coffee shops, which are up about 10%, fast food outlets up about 28%, and whilst fish and chip shops have fallen, Chinese and Indian takeaways, pizza delivery shops have more than doubled. So even with the kind of pub closures that we've all seen in the headlines for a few years, the category has in fact increased, admittedly only by 2%, seems to counter the national trend. So all of those closures perhaps have been kind of focused on some villages and suburban areas that have been later converted to housing. So that really then leads us to the second trend that I want to highlight, one that has been widely cited by others. That's people's desire to spend money on doing things, on going on holiday, having a meal, drink with friends, rather than buying ever more stuff. Of course, this took a knock with COVID lockdowns when people couldn't go out, but the trend in the data is clear. The number of shops and retail in town centres is on a downward trend. The number of services are on the rise. Since 2012, the proportion of outlets in use as shops has fallen, so that 65% of all units are now services. Hair and beauty risen by a third, food and beverage up by 20%. So in fact, if you take out the services that are declining, the banks and other offices, then the growth of the experiential sector, experiential services, even greater. What this means is that town centres are places where shopping might actually, in the next era, be regarded as very much a secondary pursuit. Their primary role is a provider of services, pampering, nice experiences, drinks with friends, or a good meal. But the diversification of the town centre does go beyond just beauty parlours and coffee shops. If we go back to Sheffield again, the city has lost a lot of its retail, as David described, but is otherwise thriving. So with 2 universities, both located in the city centre, the conversion of its old cutlery factories, colonized by creative businesses, new offices, it's seen as a very successful city and a nice place to live. So it's quite a good example of a sort of post-retail city in a way. You could also look to Sunderland on a different scale, who have encouraged their local music college to locate a campus within the city centre now, and are hanging off that quite a lot of other creative industry, music-led regeneration. The notion, of course, that town centres are about retailing, that it all dependence on shops, is sort of historical concept that isn't really accurate. They're about much more than shops. It's something that we started to accept in sort of the later half of the 20th century, but it isn't inevitable. It doesn't have to be that way. The third trend is the return to the high street of some activities that had been thought lost. That's happening across a number of sectors. One perhaps interesting example is IKEA, who are in fact strategically moving away in their business model from those huge out-of-town sheds that we're so used to, and instead are looking to create high street stores where their products are put on display, and then the purchases are delivered subsequently from a distant out-of-town warehouse. They've even taken on, of course, the flagship Topshop store in London's Oxford Street, which is, I mean, an unbelievable move that probably none of us would have predicted 10 years ago. That trend is known as showrooming. So the physical store itself is used to display the goods, to give advice, but not to transact. The purchases are made then separately online. So as a result, that's also driven by the halo effect, where online retailers get a lot more web traffic to their online sales in places that also have a physical store. As a result, some online retailers are now starting to open physical stores. Even Boohoo, for example, has opened a physical shop in Manchester. But the big return to the high street has, in fact, been the supermarkets. If we go right back to the beginning and the threat of death by supermarkets in the 50s, for the last 2 decades, major supermarkets have not been interested in doing any more of their large out-of-town stores. Since about 2014, they've really been focused on opening smaller convenience stores, normally on a high street. We haven't come across any detailed research that looks at the impact of on smaller supermarkets or convenience stores, but the number of independent food shops has increased in the last 10 years. So it suggests that strategy by the supermarkets of local convenience stores is not really negatively impacting them. Case studies such as Welling have shown the presence of a supermarket is actually still quite crucial to the success of the high street, because it acts as an anchor that other shops can rely upon. The most surprising new arrival in the high street might be Amazon and the contactless high street grocery stores that they've started to open up in some places. It's very small scale at the moment for them and in the UK, but given how ambitious and resourceful Amazon are, who knows where that'll end up. Their Chinese counterparts, Alibaba, for example, have already got a chain of 250 contactless grocery stores that use facial recognition software. So the final trend that I'd like to then come on to before I hand over to Vicky is omni-channel retailing. That is a convergence of online and physical retailing. The proportion of UK sales that takes place online has risen from 10 to almost 20% in the last 10 years. That rate obviously spiked hugely during lockdown because non-essential physical retail was forced to close. And, you know, we're all waiting to see where it settles, but it's around 26% last time we checked, and falling. As a result of that, some online retailers are actually suffering. Made.com, for example, collapsed, has misguided one of the biggest online fashion retailers. The latter was bought out of administration by the physical retailer, ironically, Fraser Group. Boohoo have warned of lower sales. ASOS have issued profit warnings. So essentially, we shouldn't assume that the march of online retailing is inexorable. And while no one knows, it might be that the online market was going to stabilize at around a quarter of all retail sales. What we suggest will happen instead is actually this continued merging of physical and online retailing, what retailers call omnichannel. Companies will have physical shops, their own website, virtual shops like Amazon, eBay, Facebook, Alibaba. And the mainstream retailers that have thrived, like Next, have really embraced that as their big strategy. In Next's case, perhaps because they've started out as a catalog retailer. So there are also opportunities for small independent retailers. The benefit for them of omnichannel retailing is that they no longer have to rely just solely on trade coming in through the front door, through that footfall on the high street. They can easily establish their own website using Shopify or Ionos to sell via social media or on sites like Etsy, Discogs, bookshop.org, as well as sort of vintage clothing sites like Depop and Thrifted to supplement the income from their physical retailing on the high street. Online retailing, therefore, has really disrupted the high street in a way by leveling the playing field between the big legacy retailers and the small insurgents. Actually, far from killing the high street, online retailing could perhaps be its savior. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Vicky, who's going to talk you through some of our recommendations of where we move forward from here.
Cool. So yeah, I get the fun part because we've given you a lot of information, and hearing all this, the obvious question you might be asking is, well, what the hell do we do about all of this? If you have any interest in a high street environment or in a high street context, you're responsible for a town centre, what do you do? And we wanted the book to be useful, and we wanted to try and provide people with a bit of guidance about how to deal with the things that are coming in the future. So I'll take you through our 8 recommendations. The first one is that although, as Lucy identified, there's no great demand at the moment for out-of-town retailing, it is important that we keep our focus on the town centre and not just for retail. So that predicted 40% excess of retail space is an opportunity for all sorts of different uses. Town centres are inherently well-connected and sustainable locations, so they're a great place to put any kind of development. So we've seen examples of more housing being introduced to town centres, which obviously supports the high street, medical, education, commercial, even light industrial in some cases. So that's kind of an option for people to think about what alternate uses might you bring into your town centre. And then next slide. Next is, so there's been a lot of people wanting to radically kind of reimagine the planning system. Simon Clarke in the Telegraph a couple of days ago said that Sunak must seize the opportunity to smash up planning rules, which, you know, everyone likes to talk about that. But our take on this is that we actually need some better and more positive town planning in our town centres. And I may bore some of you now with some slightly technical planning stuff, but Class E, which is the use class that was brought in a number of years ago, it combined most town centre uses into one class, meaning that you didn't have to apply for planning permission to change between all of those different uses. So I had to check before this. It combined shops, financial and professional services, restaurants and cafes, institution, and leisure. So those all got smushed together. You don't need planning permission to change between those. Then permitted development rights were extended that allowed you to go from that Class E, smushing everything together, to residential with a process called prior approval. So that then allows you to go from any of those uses to housing. And in some ways that's been really good because it's allowed flexibility, and we do need flexibility in our high streets and town centres, but it's also removed many of the tools that were being used to shape and to curate town centres. So when we're thinking about how to lose that 40%, as Lucy identified on a national level, that's going to be, you know, just disproportionate. Some places will lose more than others, but also within an individual town centre context, you sort of want to decide where some of that 40% loss takes place. You don't want it to just be scattered around. Ideally, you might want to retain some retail focus in a defined area and then have the rest of it go to other uses. So we think that there should be more opportunities basically to take that curational role. Next slide. This is a good one. I think, like, hearing all of the crises that David outlined, the thing that links them all is that we had no idea that they were going to happen. And we've seen a lot of failures arise from the fact that people have planned and built for specific uses or specific users. So, you know, like those big shopping malls, those big floor plate stores that were primarily designed for Debenhams, that's fine until that trend falls away or that particular retailer goes bust, and then you're left with something that isn't very adaptable. So our recommendation for the future is to create a high street that is flexible. So create, if you were building new development, to create spaces that can be subdivided or adapted, or to go back in and try and find ways of retrofitting those larger floor plate stores to make them smaller and more adaptable and more flexible. Next slide. And then, yeah, this is about the kind of the diversity of retail. And we saw in the various crises that the bigger players, the high street was very reliant on them. And when their fortunes change, the fortunes of the high street change. And some of them are still with us, but they need less space and they don't carry the same power in terms of drawing people into the high street that they once did. And this leaves space for independent services, leisure and other uses that we talked about to take up that 40% excess. And there is a real role for councils to encourage more diversity of uses on the town centre and more diversity of retailers. So encouraging startups, supporting existing businesses and getting creative about new uses. Next slide. Some of the biggest barriers to successful high streets that we saw related much more to property and the economics rather than the design of the place. So despite reduced demand for retailing, the rents don't always fall because that's the basis upon which the valuation of the store is set. So the owner wants to retain that value. There's also things like the very high upfront costs of fit out when there's a business change or like an occupier change. And so the focus really needs to be on tackling some of those issues with the property reletting process and making that as easy as possible. And then also trying to address that kind of wider economic model, which I think takes us to the next point. Yeah, this is the, yeah. So business rates, we had a conversation about this in the office the other day, and in case people aren't aware, business rates are kind of like council tax, but for businesses. They're paid in addition to the rent, and they're based on the rateable value. So it's set nationally by the Valuation Office Agency. So it's not controlled at the local level. Business rates can often be significantly higher than rent, and they can undermine a lot of the other interventions that we're talking about. Like they can be the kind of make or break between a business being able to sustain itself and not. They have been investigated by the government, and there was some relief offered in the last autumn statement. And Labour, I think, have said that they will abolish the system altogether. So that is something that's kind of outside of most people's local level control, but it's something that we're kind of advocating for at a national level. Next slide. Falling rents and shorter, less certain leases mean that retail development as we know it is not really viable. So you don't tend to make a lot of money out of a retail development these days. And we saw three different alternative ways of approaching this. One is basing town centre viability on office and residential, which are more profitable uses that you can see a more definite return on investment. So that's seeing retail more as a service than an asset. We've also seen, as Lucy, I think, highlighted, developers taking over large retail spaces for less than they would cost to build. So instead of building them new, they take them over and then they develop the space incrementally. And Bobby's in Bournemouth and Commune in Sheffield are examples of those. And then there's public intervention. So in Barnsley, we saw that the council was investing in retail not to generate income, but using public borrowing to buy vacant space and then bring it back into use as kind of a public good for the town centre. And then the final one, next slide. Yeah, so we put this one last, and it's one that a lot of people would put first when looking at how to improve a town centre environment. So yeah, obviously as urban designers, we like to think that public realm improvements and new benches and signage and seating and all that kind of thing is going to be the thing that makes or breaks a place. But I think in the research and in the other recommendations we've made, you can see that all of that stuff, if it's not part of a more holistic picture that takes into account some of the structural factors and economic elements, it's not going to do what we need it to do on its own. So kind of doing ourselves out of a job there, but that's where we'll end. I know, David, I think you were going to maybe do another case study depending how we've gone on time, but I think we
decided not, because
I think we're at like 50 minutes or so, so maybe leave it there. We've bombarded people with information.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Yes, that was a lot of information. So I hope everyone has, I can see some people who I can see on screen and was scrolling notes down. So yes, thank you very much. Those are obviously all of your contact details on there, and you were going to put in the chat box a link to the book as well. So if anybody is interested in obviously making that purchase and having a good read of those 100 case studies, then I think possibly one of you will put that. If not, we will send it in an email as well, just after the event. So thank you very much, all three of you. That was, yes, a very quick run through of a very big book, I'm sure. We haven't had any questions in the chat box. So what I'm going to do is just open the floor up and see if anybody wants to make any comments or ask you any questions at all from the group. So is there anybody in particular who would like to? Look, fabulous. Thank you, Lucy. The link is in the chat for anybody who wants to purchase the book. Has anybody got any questions at all for David, Lucy, or Vicky? So we have deadly silence. You've answered everybody's questions and solved the whole high street issue that we've got. I mean, you know, some of the stuff that you kind of really put online. One thing I wanted to ask was, Lucy, you obviously mentioned that there's been a decrease of online, and obviously some of these companies like Made, Misguided have gone under since that. Do you think that's possibly also down to a high competition level? Because I think a lot of people have thought, oh, you know, it looks easy, we can go online, we can do this, we can do that. It's a lower kind of investment cost in that. Do you think there's something in that as well? Do you think there's those high levels of competition will also have an effect on that?
Well, I think it's certainly fair to say that physical retailing carries a lot more overheads, you know, including rent, including perhaps larger staffing, but also that comes down to business rates as well. Business rates are disproportionately penalise physical retailers. Online retailers pay a much smaller percentage of their turnover. So yes, you can opportunistically try your hand as an online retailer more readily. But the reason that isn't a really big of a threat or dominating the market in the way that perhaps the headlines or our own fears might suggest is that it's actually still quite attractive to consumers to be able to go feel the product, sit on the sofa, talk to someone, and that's reassuring, even if they make the purchase online later, which is where that halo effect comes in. So so that authenticity and experience and touching and feeling things still plays a much larger part than I think we might have suspected.
And that goes back to what you were saying, you know, people buy experiences more now than physical goods, and all of that kind of thing, I suppose, doesn't it?
Well, that too, yes. I mean, the breakdown basically of what occupies space on our high streets is changing. It's not going to be dominated by retail anymore. And we should probably really anticipate that continuing. And as Vicky said, plan for that, just rather than having another fixed vision of what we think the high street should be next, accept that this is a constant state of flux. I mean, it's true, of course, generally that our towns and cities are never a finished product, sadly. The job is never done. They just constantly evolve. So we should be putting in place structures, both physically and non-physically, systems that can support further change down the line.
Yes, and I think David's introduction with kind of how the high street used to be in the town centres really set that scene well. I love the old photos. I love to see how it used to be, and you know, you can go back even further. But obviously, that was a really nice insight. Thank you very much, Lucy. And then since then, we've had a barrage of questions in the chat box. So good job, I did ask that one. So Jen says, really helpful overview. It's easy to forget the ups and downs that have happened over the last few decades. Looking to the future, how can we make high streets more sustainable, both environmentally and economically? Can the future of the high street be based on consumerism? Who wants to answer that one?
I mean, Vicky answered it to an extent in one of the idea about smaller units and a higher turnover. So, you know, sowing 1,000 seeds rather than having a few, you know, mono crops, which is what we've essentially had. So the diversity is a really important thing. And because you don't know what's going to thrive and what's not going to thrive, and therefore, if you've got a bit of everything, then you're much more insured to that. Sorry, Vicky, you were going to jump in there.
No, I was just thinking about the sustainability question, and I think in one of the slides I talked about the fact that traditional high streets, like how they evolved and where they evolved, are inherently sustainable locations. They were either like at junctures where a lot of people came together, or like crossroads, and they've sort of like grown up from there. So I think you're right that they don't just have to be about commercialism. Like, they can be the centers of places, but they don't have to be necessarily the shopping centers of places anymore. And that was kind of what we were talking about as well, with different uses being located there. So I think, was it Stockport in the book that is looking to relocate its hospital closer to the town centre?
Yeah,
so it's more of those kind of like civic uses, the services and things that people need aside from like commercial activity, I think potentially is the future of high streets.
Yeah, the Stockport example is one of our favourite ones because it's just such a clever move. They've got a big Debenhams that's now defunct, horrible bit of infrastructure that's difficult to do anything else with, but they're moving their hospital from a peripheral out-of-town site into that much more accessible one and funding it by selling the out-of-town site for housing. And that gets you lots of boxes ticked all at once. You know, you made that work economically, but also you're bringing more footfall onto your high street and to support the businesses that are there. Can support active travel plans. You can support more public transport journeys to the hospital rather than people having to schlep out of town. So ecologically and economically, it makes a lot of sense. I don't think everyone's got a hospital that you can relocate, but we suspect that everyone has something, whether it's council offices or other forms of things that have started to locate themselves peripherally, given half the chance, bring it back into the centre.
And that links nicely to a comment that Bev has just put into the chat box, saying retrofitting older buildings rather than demolishing them and replacing with new builds where possible is a good start in the whole thing, you know, environmentally, everything. So that pretty much, I think, sums that up. So thank you very much for that, Bev.
So the exception to that is maybe where something has been constructed that was so tailored to a specific use, and in like shopping centers is a good example. Like, yes, in an ideal world you would keep the building and like keep the embodied carbon, and you would find new ways to reuse the shopping center, but sometimes they are so outlandish and so poorly kind of sitting within a high street context that sometimes the right thing to do is demolition, but that should be considered in a very kind of nuanced way. David, I don't know if you want to talk about Broadmarsh a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, we're working on Broadmarsh and Nottingham at the moment, which was a shopping centre which was owned by Into, which was partway being refurbished when Into went bust, and the council inherited the shopping centre and had decided to turn it into something quite different. So the idea at the moment, and I have to say we're currently working on this, and so I can't necessarily say a huge amount. And actually, we're probably slightly more optimistic in the book about what could happen to Broadmarsh than actually is proving to be possible in reality. But the idea is to take the frame of the old shopping centre and fill it with independent uses. That's the concept which we're trying to make work. And this is a transformation of actually, one thing that is happening in Broadmarsh is the CDC, which is the Community Diagnostic Centre, which is a local hospital, is being put into it as well. So as Vicky said, that's another example of health facilities going in there. So I think it's using it in a completely different way, that shopping infrastructure.
There's
That's good to hear.
At least there was in the previous iteration, there's like a public open space aspect to it. And I think there's another, I can't remember, it's one of the Greater Manchester authorities. They're exploring the possibility of turning sections of their high street into a public park. So obviously that provides some like commercial issues. It's quite an ambitious thing to do.
We also were, I was last night, in fact, I was in Stockton-on-Tees, and that wasn't one of our case studies, and it should have been, because the council in Stockton-on-Tees bought both shopping centres boldly, and knocked one of them down to create a park, and the other one they moved all the shops into that other shopping centre. So they filled up the one shopping centre and knocked down the other one to create a town centre park. A fantastic bold move to revive a shopping centre.
I think that's book number 2 then, David. So another 100 case studies on the way. It's nice to hear about Nottingham. That's quite close to home, and for me and Bev actually. So it's quite interesting to hear, kind of what cities such as Nottingham, especially with, they've done a lot of regeneration works as well. That's been nice to follow. So fabulous. Thank you very much for that. The next question is from Ravi. In the trend of March of the Independence, the term daisy chain was mentioned. Is it possible to explain what this means, please?
So this is in our Colchester case study. Colchester, the businesses in Colchester got together in this fantastically lively local business association in an area called the Lanes, I think it was called. I think it's called the Lanes. And daisy chaining is basically when you pass customers from one place to another. So each retailer undertakes to pass on recommendations and customers to other retailers in the area. They also had like a group loyalty scheme for all the independent retailers in the town, and they did late night opening, and they put live music on for late night opening and so on. Fantastic stuff. The twist or the sting in the tail in that was the council didn't recognise it. They actually won High Street of the Year, the local traders, at one point, but the council through under Business Improvement District just it sort of reading between the lines, they sort of thought these were uppity, difficult traders who were causing trouble rather than necessarily collaborating. So unfortunately, they closed down the association in the end because of frustration, lack of public support. So there's a really nice story in there, but there's also a sad one, unfortunately.
That's a huge shame, because I mean, have you also found that probably independents tend to work together better than obviously the bigger chains, I presume, don't really, whereas I think the independents, as you say, they do tend to come together, they kind of work together, they refer, they recommend, that kind of thing. Do you find that is quite a...
I think it's true to an extent, and Colchester was a really good example of that. I mean, lots of towns have business improvement districts. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, that's basically where you have a precept of 1 penny on the rate, and that is then spent maybe by a town centre manager or someone like that in town. And they tend to be the preserve of bigger businesses. And so people like Boots play a very active role in business improvement districts. So and actually in Colchester, the business improvement district were the ones who weren't recognising the smaller retailers. And so you do have this collaboration of the larger retailers, but it doesn't always encompass the smaller independents.
Thank you, David. Next question is from Mark. We've kind of covered this. Obviously, you've said about Stockport, but he asks, are there other examples of council and health service you can suggest which have been successfully relocated to high streets? I was to say, you've mentioned Stockport. Is there any others that you can think of that would be?
Well, these CDCs are a new thing in the National Health Service, so community diagnostic centres, and the idea, they have like MRI scanners in them, and they have, so the idea is rather than going to an outpatient in a hospital, you can do it on your local high street. And so actually it's a really good example of the NHS coming back to the high street along with other things. So Stockton-on-Tees has got a CDC on its high street as well as the Nottingham one. And whilst I don't know about the rest of the programme, I suspect quite a lot of them are being located in places which are traditional high streets.
The other
Chris,
one,
sorry,
just quickly to add in there, the other one that's happening in quite a number of places at different scales is institutional uses. So higher education universities looking to develop city centre campuses, which has lots of advantages for them in terms of the student experience and staff accessibility, etc., if that can be incentivised and facilitated. And also further education colleges in perhaps some smaller scale places that don't have universities, encouraging that, and that's happened in a few different instances.
Fabulous. Chris has just put in there, Alty has a hospital. Not sure where that is. I've not heard of that. Fabulous.
Altrincham,
Thank you.
I imagine.
Altrincham?
I'm guessing.
An
I don't know, though.
abbreviation.
It may not be.
Chris, can you just confirm? So we know what you're talking about. Altrincham, yeah.
Altrincham, yeah.
Altrincham, yeah. Fabulous.
And
Thank you, Chris.
Altrincham was amazing because Altrincham was the town centre with the highest vacancy rate in about 2008. I mean, it was literally bottom of all the local papers picked it up that Altrincham was bottom, and it's not just Altrincham Market, but it is actually quite a lot to do with Altrincham Market. That transformation by Nick Johnson that we do write up in the book has now spread out into the rest of Altrincham, and despite its House of Fraser store and its Debenhams closing, it is still thriving as a town centre and is now up there at the top of our figures. So that's a real transformation, Altrincham.
Yeah, fabulous. Vicky's just kindly put in the chat box for everybody the CDC locations list as well for you if you wanted to have a click on that. And Bev from Heritage Trust Network has also commented, during the pandemic, some NHS services went to the high street, such as what happened at Moseley Muslim Community Centre in the Old School of Art, a template for the future that they want to keep. I'm just thinking, seeing in touch if you want to do. Fabulous. Joanna said, amazing talk. No immediate questions, but I need to know more for my UK SPF high street interventions. You've just sold another copy of the book. So there you go. Thank you, Joanne. That's good to know that's the case. Fabulous. Next question. I'm just trying to find the next one because I keep going back and forth to comments and everything like that. How far do you think the reluctance of landlords and retail agents to be flexible is part of the problem? Do you think they are in denial?
You want me to say yeah, yes, yes, but they're not. They're stuck basically. So whenever you remember, whenever there was an announcement that another retailer had gone into voluntary administration, and they were always going there, negotiations going on with the landlords to reduce the rents, because that was always one of the reasons they did that, to try and renegotiate the rents. But Into, and I don't hold any candle for Into, their valuation dropped by 98%. So in the end, they were worth a few million. I mean, 130 million or something, and they started off being worth like 4.5 billion. Literally, their share price disappeared completely, and the retail landlords are all in a similar position. So they're all heavily invested. They all have very limited room for manoeuvre in terms of rents. And actually, one of the agents described to us how what they're doing in terms of trying to incentivize people to come into shopping centres is not reducing the rents, because that reduces their value. So they give a rent-free period instead. So they say you can have a 3-year lease, and you can have a 2-year rent-free period. And so we only charge the full rent for the last year, but still the headline rent doesn't change, and so the valuation remains the same. But they're doing all these things. In the past, you used to do 20-year leases minimum, and now it's like a 3-year lease. And so yeah, it's no longer an investable proposition, retail. You can't invest commercially in retail, which is worrying, because it means you can't invest on refurbishments and repair as well as new build.
I think the only other thing that came up, I don't know if we talked about it loads in the book, but kind of the absentee landlord thing. So people owning shops but not living in the area and not feeling a sense of responsibility as to what happens. Like they've got the asset and they're getting the benefits of that, but not like I went to Wisbeach for another project, and they said that they'd introduced a scheme where there was grant funding available to redo shop fronts, but the thing that they were really struggling with sometimes was just getting hold of people and actually encouraging them to make use of it. So obviously a local business and a local owner who's invested in the area will probably take that up really quickly and make use of it, but somebody who's living externally just maybe isn't going to be as bothered.
Some councils have acted as sort of matchmakers as well, where it can be quite difficult for small businesses or startups to actually find out who owns this empty unit. I wouldn't mind leasing it. So they kind of keep a roster of small businesses, maybe things that have started as home businesses, or things that would like to try their hand at taking a first physical space, and keeping record of who owns the units that are vacant and trying to pair them up and broker some kind of deal.
That's a good intervention, because I know, because I've even done the street pounding, you know, kind of talking to all the owners, and they're trying to find out, it's things like that, and they do it through an agent and all of that thing. So that's sometimes most of the detective work that you need to do that takes up the time. So fabulous. Thank you all. Next question from Claire. Oh no, sorry, Victoria. She's from Gateshead Council, and she's taking on the role of Town Centre Manager for Gateshead, which is a really exciting opportunity, and the first time that they've actually had that resource become available. She asks, what piece of advice could you give her for the first 6 months in post?
Well, we're very glad to hear that you've got that job. I think we all feel quite positive about that role, actually. It's something that is missing, as you kind of alluded to, in a lot of places. And it means there isn't that ongoing relationship with landlords, with retailers, both big and small. So I suppose I'm sure the other two will chip in some other things, but the first thing that springs to mind for me is the value that you can contribute in being the kind of social connector and starting to understand the landscape in your particular place of all the different key actors and what are the obstacles for them specifically. You know, we've generalized it essentially, but each of those individual owners, retailers will have something in particular. And so having that legacy and continuation with the town centre manager is really, really valuable.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of town centre strategies that we did for Barnsley and for Radcliffe, and we took a similar approach in our advice with both of them, which is to kind of take a go with the flow approach to management. So rather than saying like, okay, we're going to turn our town centre into this thing and like wrenching it in one particular direction, like looking and figuring out what is currently happening, what's currently working, what businesses are successful, what's thriving, and trying to just kind of stoke those small fires rather than do something completely different. At least for the first 6 months. It may be that after that time you're like, nope, we need to do something radical. But yeah, I think understanding what's currently working is a really good approach.
It'd be good to look at the case that we did the Metro Centre as well, which of course is in Gateshead and was the first and biggest centre in the country. But I think I'm right to say that on our vacancy rates, it also had the second highest vacancy rate on the last figures, which is 2022, so a couple of years old. It may have improved since then, but actually Westfield in Stratford and Metro Centre were the two worst shopping centres in terms of vacancy. So it obviously has issues as well, but it killed Gateshead, didn't it? I mean, the outcome, Newcastle survived because Newcastle invested in Eldon Square at the same time as the Metro Centre, but it absolutely killed Gateshead. And so in a sense, you're picking up the pieces for the damage that was done by the Metro Centre.
Heritage Trust Network have just held their 3-day conference there as well. So we've made some good connections in Gateshead. If that helps, get in touch with us, because we'd be more than happy to introduce you to some of those guys that have kind of started to try and obviously support that aspect. So get in touch with us, because we might be able to, a few little connections for you anyway. So thank you for that question, Victoria. We've had a few more kind of different comments in the chat box. So Jenna has said that she's seen a great charity shop superstore in Edinburgh recently as a pop-up. which is interesting to see how collaboration between sectors can work like this, which is quite nice. And there are some new creative ways of that people are obviously kind of working together. And Jen's responding saying, interesting, I think historically charity shops have been seen as a negative thing for town centres, but I think it would be great to see more reuse, repair, repurposing on the high street to counter some of the issues of fast fashion, etc. And obviously that's quite a big issue at the moment as well, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, they were always a sign of decline. They were always seen as a sign of decline, but actually I've always felt that they're occupying units and they're doing a valuable service. And so I've got nothing against charity shops at all.
And I think as we see kind of different generations using the high street, that is going to become increasingly attractive to people. I think, yeah, there's whole generations who, like, either because of care for the environment or just the economic picture, that buying secondhand and reusing is much more desirable.
Yes, it's definitely a hot topic, and I think as well with the kind of increase of costs and in everybody's everyday living, I think, you know, that is something that needs to obviously to continue. So yes, definitely. Diane has said, I've only recently taken over management of the markets in her area, but she's using them as a tool to increase vibrancy to the town centres, which is quite a nice thing to do. It's outdoors and, you know, kind of that sort of thing. Jenna has commented, heritage assets in towns are also harder to take over as they often have structural access and huge service costs, which most of us will probably know due to working on heritage projects. Just left to rot and literally fall down, so then become dangerous and cost to local authorities, banks mostly, and police stations. But people are, again, they're doing interesting things with these old buildings, aren't they? And, you know, kind of making the use of them.
Poprex in Sunderland, which is done by the Heritage Trust in Sunderland, is a fantastic example. So that was the old Bins department store, one of the old Bins department stores, which has been converted into. Bins was an amazing department store chain, which actually headquartered in Sunderland, but had stores all over the north. There was a later Bins in London, but the original Bins has been taken over by the Heritage Trust locally and turned into Poprex, which is a record shop, independent record shop with a stage and a venue and a community kitchen all in the same building. And it's all part of that thing that Lucy mentioned about Sunderland using music as a focus for your generation, and that's a really good heritage asset being used for that.
I do think the point though, like, that it does cost money to bring some of these units back into kind of their full vibrancy, and there is probably a bit of a role at a national government level to make funding available. You know, if they are serious about keeping the high street alive and regenerating the high street, like, people do need funds to draw from to enable them to do this. And there's like the Heritage Action Fund and there's High Streets Fund, so there are examples of those, but it is quite competitive, I think, how that gets allocated.
One of the things I've come across, we did some fringe events at the Labour and Conservative Party conferences recently on high streets with Centre for Cities. And one of the things that came up with the Conservatives was a kind of interest in particular dealing with heritage buildings by sort of gifting them to community groups, which, you know, it's a case-by-case basis, but I think we also have to be careful there that, as is implied by the original question from Jenna, that is also a kind of huge liability. They're very complicated things to deal with, very costly. So, you know, offloading that onto community groups that may not have the skills or the resources, financial or otherwise, to handle it is not necessarily going to be the silver bullet. The other thing which came up while I was in Belfast, actually, after I saw you in Hannah for the other event, was that Belfast City Council is an example of somewhere that is deliberately, strategically buying up all the heritage buildings that they can in their centre, because they feel those are the ones most at risk. And they haven't necessarily got very far with filling them as yet, but they're doing that to protect them because they recognise, of course, that there is this additional cost, and that if they're left for too long, they become kind of, you know, well, at some point they go beyond the point of no return. So that's a legitimate strategy as well, one which, you know, we'll have to wait and see how it pays off or not in the long term.
Yes, I think we were both quite well. Sorry, David.
Just get also in Northern Ireland, dairy is amazing. So the Dairy Trust, which owns about a third of the town centre, which goes right the way back to the 70s when it was set up, and they've been buying hotels and department stores and shops and workspace and housing, and they've completely regenerated Derry, the old town within the walls, and that's all heritage and trust-based investment rather than commercial investment.
Yes, it was interesting when we were in Belfast, you know, and I was surprised at how very few people actually lived in the centre, but literally all of the units in the town centre, the shops, there was nothing. Literally, they were all vacant and all of that kind of thing. So it's interesting that they're kind of buying all those up.
Belfast has a real problem because there was a huge fire in 2017, and the big department store in Belfast burnt down to the ground, and it became unstable, and so they had to block the main high street because it was going to fall down, and that killed the town centre. The vacancy rate went up astronomically before COVID, and then just as they reopened it, COVID hit, and so Belfast has particular problems with its retailing because of that.
David, our CEO, just commented, Inner City Trust in Derry is a network member as well. So you know, yes. And as Bev has just put in there, you know, the Heritage Trust Network is here to support those sorts of groups as well. So if anybody is here from those groups, please get in touch with us, because you know, that's what Heritage Trust Network is very much about. Wonderful. There are no further questions in the chat box, but thank you for some of the links that Vicky has been putting in there as well. So thank you for that, Vicky.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just need to drop off because I have another meeting. But thank you very much for organising, and thanks everyone. It's nice to see David and Lucy on screen, at least, if not in person.
Thank you, Vicky. Yeah, so
right, see you.
Thank you. So yeah, thank you for those links. So if anybody wants to click on those in the chat box, they are the Heritage Action Zones that are funded by Historic England in there, and also the Government Future High Streets funds as well. So if you want to have a click on those to see where they are, and obviously, you know, you can kind of probably get in contact with the different people on there as well. Wonderful. So before we go, are there any further questions or comments that you'd like to ask Lucy and David before we say goodbye to you all this afternoon? By all means, unmute yourselves if needs be, if you don't like the chat box. No. Wonderful.